Two major stories dominating the headlines for weeks find themselves at a controversial crossroad. The COVID-19 lockdown and protests following the death of George Floyd are bringing renewed focus on law enforcement and America's freedoms, or lack thereof. We first saw this when citizens who dared to break government quarantine orders or protested to reopen their states were threatened with criminal prosecution. Something Timothy Head of the Faith and Freedom Coalition writes is a dangerous misuse of criminal law.
We're seeing that kind of heavy-handed approach across the country, literally impacting every single human life in the United States of America right now.
And during this wave of civil unrest and protest, we've seen peaceful demonstrators, even journalists, arrested, pepper sprayed, and shot with rubber bullets like criminals for exercising their constitutional rights. A demonstration, some say, of America's problem with over-criminalization.
If we end up criminalizing conduct that your average person would never have recognized was wrong, then people will all of a sudden lose respect for the rule of law.
These are regulations people break unwittingly because it doesn't seem like behavior that would or should be criminal. And they're everywhere. In North Carolina, for example, counties, cities, and towns, even metropolitan sewerage districts have the power to create ordinances that automatically carry the punishment of a Class 3 misdemeanor. And on the federal level, efforts to count the number of regulations with criminal penalties have been abandoned because it's an impossible task.
I've seen the estimate of at least 300,000, it's probably more like 400 or 500,000 regulations that carry criminal penalties.
And the fact is, it's hard to get them off the books. President Trump could sign an executive order directing agencies to get rid of regulations with criminal penalties. But it wouldn't happen overnight. To do it legally would take years. So during this time of civil unrest, there's actually something that unites Americans. There is no one in the United States over the age of 18 who cannot be indicted for some federal crime. That is not an exaggeration, says John Baker, a retired LSU law professor. For years in a number of cities, from Flint to Shreveport, wearing saggy pants was criminalized, a regulation that disproportionately targeted young black men for sporting a popular fashion trend despite its controversy.
When the same law is applied differently or has different impacts in different constituencies and communities, it makes all of us actually fundamentally suspicious of the system.
And that suspicion has reached a boiling point.
We don't want no more police. Is that clear? We don't want people with guns toting around in our community, shooting us down.
In New York, the nation's largest city, Mayor Bill de Blasio vows to cut police funding. In Minneapolis, the city council has voted to dismantle its police department.
Our commitment is to end our city's toxic relationship with the Minneapolis Police Department, to end policing as we know it.
And in the midst of this debate over policing and crime, many Americans are hopeful the nation's problems with over-criminalization will begin to be addressed.
When light shows up, darkness has to go away. So we're hoping with all this light that all the darkness will go away and stay away.
I hate to have this discussion with that nonsense of defunding the police. I mean, it's just a nightmare to think, but Minneapolis is maybe on the way to doing it, but who then is going to, if there's a 911 call, who's going to answer the call? And somebody's breaking into my house, well, tough luck. The police isn't available, 911, nobody to answer your call because we've just defunded it. Well, that's nonsense, and nobody's going to go along with that, and anybody who does for it is going to be crazy. But before all this happened, the United States still had on the books, can you imagine, so many criminal penalties that people can't even count them. Is it 300,000? Is it 400,000? Is it 500,000? 100,000 regulations. Our Washington correspondent Jennifer Wishon joins us now. And Jennifer, why can't the president just sign an executive order, at least in relation to these federal agencies, to nullify some of these laws?
Well, Pat, he certainly can. And I can tell you, a few weeks ago, he actually did something similar to that with the economy. He is, as you know, desperately trying to get our economy back on track. And so he signed an executive order directing his agencies, and I have the language here, to rescind, modify, waive, or provide exemptions from regulations that inhibit economic recovery that are consistent with the law and that do not that protect the public health and safety. And so he did that citing this current economic emergency that we're in. So certainly the president could direct his cabinet secretaries to take a look at the regulations under their purview that have criminal penalties and work to get rid of them. The issue, as you said, Pat, is that there are hundreds of thousands of these. I mean, as I reported, there have been efforts to actually count them, and people have given up. These are smart people, and they just say there's too many. We're already at 300,000, and we're done. We're not going to keep counting. And so it's a problem. And the other part of that is that if you go through the normal process, which we've seen the president doing, he's already slashed a number of regulations throughout his first term. It's a long process. So when these agencies get a law from Congress, they have to figure out what it is Congress is trying to do. They have to write the regulations, and then there's a public comment period. So when you get rid of one, it's kind of the process in reverse. It takes a long time. So I think if you're trying to get rid of all of these, or even a fraction of these, it's going to take a long time. But certainly this is something the president could take a look at and speed it along.
Well, Jennifer, if somebody is labeled as a criminal, say he's 18 years old, say he's a black guy, and he went into the convenience stores and he put some gum in his pocket, and they pick him up and they say that's a felony, you just, that's a larceny, you stole something, and so he gets a felony conviction. What happens to him the rest of his life?
Well, it depends on where he's locked up. I mean, states are very different. And of course, politics change in states. But, this is, I mean, you mentioned the societal impact that this has on families and on communities. And I know that we've talked about these three strikes laws. So in some cases, you have young people that have gotten into some trouble, and then they get caught stealing a pair of socks or some chewing gum at a convenience store. 3 strikes and you're out, and they are serving a life sentence. And again, think about the toll that takes on that person's life, on their family's lives, and also to the taxpayer. It costs about $30,000 to $60,000 a year per inmate, depending on what state they're in, to keep them incarcerated. $60,000 is a salary a lot of Americans would certainly like to have. And so it is a huge cost to society, both morally and financially.
Well, Jennifer, if somebody has a felony conviction, he or she can't run for office. They can't be a member of the bar. They can't be a police officer. I'm not even sure in certain areas whether they can vote. I mean, you've taken away most of their privileges as a citizen. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. And so that's a big problem that a lot of Americans have. And they say, look, if you've done the time and you get out, then you should be able to have your rights restored as a human being or as a citizen of this country. My husband's an attorney, and he is often working with people to get their gun rights restored and their voting rights. But again, that's a process. That's an expense that people have. They have to get through this barrier after they have served their time.
It's just horrible to comment, but I was listening, just happened to flip across that show called The Doctors, and they had an eminent psychiatrist talking about the brain of a young person, and he said basically until a person is about 25, 26 years old, the raging hormones that are going on inside, even though his prefrontal cortex may be formed, that he can't really control all these things he's doing. And if he gets put arrested on one of these charges, he's ruined for life. And yet, in a sense, he's maybe just a teenage prank, and yet he's got a felony conviction. All the rest of his life, you can't expunge it, can you?
That's right. I mean, there are ways to do it, but it's not easy for the average person to get past that. So you're right. It is a mark for life. For life. We have one life to live. And so that is a heavy burden for so many people who are locked up in America. And you said it, Pat. I mean, who would think that the United States of America would be the country in the world that locks up the most people per capita? You know, you have to think about the morality of that and why is that? And you look at our federal code, you look at the hundreds of thousands of these regulations with criminal penalties, you look at state codes. I mean, here's the thing, Pat. When state legislatures and Congress go to work every year, they're not going to work to take away, they're going to add. And you look at, I mean, oftentimes it is not unusual for state legislatures to pass several thousand bills every year. Many of those deal with their criminal codes. And you think about it, in a year, did we really need 1,000 fixes to our law? Probably not. But that is the system that we live in. And like I mentioned, President Trump doing away with a lot of these regulations. He's now cut 8 regulations on average for every one that he has added. That is unprecedented in the history of this country, in the history of the office of the presidency. Because again, that's not what elected leaders tend to focus on, not getting rid of, but they add to. And so we're kind of in this vicious cycle.
Jennifer, we want to talk, we can't do it right now, but I understand part 2 of this. We want to find out how much it's going to actually cost. And the whole idea, as I understand, they're farming the prison system out to private enterprise, and they in turn get their money from how many prisoners get incarcerated. So you'll tell us about that tomorrow?
Absolutely.
How much do you think it's going to be, the cost is from all this incarceration?
It's hundreds of billions of dollars, Pat. And as you mentioned, this private prison issue is, to many Americans, it's really outrageous.